Hello, good evening, and welcome to tonight's live interaction. I'm very happy to have you over. Although I'm a little preoccupied, there seems to be some kind of an electricity emergency at home itself. Uh, as of now, somebody's attending to it. I may have to run out to call the electrician. Uh, I don't know. Let's see, God willing, let's hope for the best. On that note, I have to start today's live interaction. I may have to abort it also in the meanwhile, in the middle of it. I'm sorry, but emergencies happen. Uh, so what can we do? Anyway, tonight I'm trying my best to uh, keep it going, so to say. Uh, the interaction is about what we have learned in the book video about the impact of calamities on infrastructure. And I have a cat disturbing me. Uh, about how it can decimate infrastructure and the economy. uh, Livelihoods are lost, landscape is lost. If you see South Asia, it is the theater of calamities and disaster mitigation. You have fragile landscapes, you have very fragile ecosystems under severe pressure of developmental polemics. So, I mean, you'll take instances like Sundarbans. There are millions of people living in the Sundarbans, for instance. They have they are living in abject poverty. They do not have access to infrastructure, education, and the human development quotient. Whether they have to live there is another question altogether. But nevertheless, they are living there. It's a fact that they are living there. And Sundarbans is an amphitheater for climate change. And apart from climate change, it's a very seismically active area, though there are not volcanoes, active volcanoes, except for Barren Island in Andaman Nicobar Islands. There aren't many active volcanoes in this part of South and Southeast Asia. If you take away Indonesia and the Philippines from this context, I mean, Indonesia and Philippines have a lot of volcanoes. Uh, but in mainland South and Southeast Asia, you don't have volcanoes. So, and volcanoes are in the news this week, the past week, after the Tonga eruption. And we are going to learn in the next couple of weeks the regulatory effect that volcanoes have on climate change. So that's one interesting aspect coming up in the next few weeks. But let's talk about the impact of natural calamities on the economy. uh, you can say every human activity which allows us to earn a livelihood or which induces an economic transaction can be part of the economy. When there are not enough opportunities for economic transaction, when livelihoods are impacted, when lives and livelihoods are threatened by calamities, it could, I mean, it's not just the Asian tsunami. It's Asian tsunami was but an opportunity to learn about how to cope with disasters. So let me see if there's any questions. Not yet. So you see, there are, I mean, it can be debilitating. A monster calamity like on the scale of the Asian tsunami can be devastating on the human landscape. In the Asian tsunami, for instance, 227,898 people succumbed, or they died at the mercy of the marauding waves. People who were dependent on these people for their livelihoods. One second. People who are dependent on these people who died, and for their livelihood, they were orphaned. They did not have financial or fiscal security, or even, what do you say, yeah, they didn't have a means of livelihood. And they didn't have a means of livelihood, not just in terms of salary or financial security, and with that food and livelihood security, but they also lost the means for livelihood in terms of the landscape was devastated. Fishers lost their fishing craft and gear all over the Indian Ocean rim countries which were affected by the Asian tsunami. They lost their fishing craft and gear. So they lost their means of livelihood. And apart from live, and it's always the most the most vulnerable communities are the ones who are least economically or fiscally resilient. So yes, they suffer the most. They are the most vulnerable. And then there are women and children and the frail and infirm who do not have access. If you do not have, if there are people who do not have pensions, or if you don't get relief and compensation after the calamity, if there is not enough democratic governance or a transparent governance system, and the relief and rehabilitation is not quick, then people who will be living in shelters for months and years on end, they suffer the most. Access to medicine, access to treatment, access to food, food security, nutrition, and without nutrition, people like who are chronic diabetics, if they don't get nutritive food, they really suffer. Okay, you might not pandemic scale in the fisher community, but still they don't have food security. And if in the aftermath of the Asian tsunami, for instance, they were scared to put out to sea for fishing. That is when it really affected their economic resilience, so to say. One second. I don't know. I mean, my tech support guy has just come in. Without him, I can't quite handle the many of these technical things. He's just going to crawl in now. Yeah. So you see there you are. I don't know if this is streaming enough. There you are. So these areas, which were affected by the Asian tsunami, upper upper Indian Ocean region, was extremely affected. Let's come back to this. Okay. So those were the places which were, I mean, people who are living in these kind of, geographically challenged places were the most affected. Then there were a lot of tourists. There was one report which said that there were 3,000 tourists, Swedish tourists, who succumbed to the tsunami in Thailand. This was not corroborated by official reports, so I do not know how true this reported, but this report did gain currency. One sec, my tech support guy has made a grand entry. What can I do? My tech support guy came late. So where were I? These were the geographically challenged areas. This in and around the Bay of Bengal, for example, in the Indian Ocean region above the equator, places were lost. The landscape literally was damaged. So there, yeah, this is what happened. So that is why there is a need for democratic, transparent governance. Where am I again? There is a need for democratic and a very transparent governance so that compensation, rehabilitation, and reconstruction all goes on in a very transparent manner. That's very essential. Many of us have learned of, shall we say, lessons have been learned. It has been very well documented. And there's also the question of reconstruction, rehabilitation, rescue and recovery, then the treatment of the injured, rehabilitation and reconstruction in the near term and long term. And of course, there is a need for sustainable solutions. It could be in the field of, shall we say, earthquake safe architecture, or it could be it could be in the in the phase, in the question, in the realm of reconstruction. Could be in the realm of reconstruction. So there is a need for, there is a very, very heavy economic aspect to it. Uh, so that is why it is very essential to document economic resilience and fiscal lessons learned. That is, I think, the greatest output of this particular lesson in disaster mitigation. Cost of what do you mean cost of reconstruction? Cost of reconstruction varies. If you want to have, say, for example, uh, you want to build multi-purpose disaster shelters. That is for the long term. That is mitigation for the next round of calamities. So if you want to make it, if you want to construct, say, disaster shelters in chronically vulnerable areas. Let me take an example. In Karnataka, the Indian state of Karnataka, for example, um, there has been a World Bank project to fund construction of disaster relief shelters on the west coast of India. In my home state in Karnataka, it has not been completed in more than 5 to 10 years. That is, it points to lack of transparent governance. It points to there are indications of corruption, or why hasn't it been completed is a question that we need to ask. Whereas in Orissa, in the Indian state of Orissa, which is a very disaster prone state, they, especially in a particular district called Puri, you would have surely heard of Puri and Konark temple and all that. That is right in the path of cyclones. I will tell you where. I will show it to you. I will just show it to you here. This is the state. I need this is Orissa state, and Behrampur somewhere here is the state of the district of Puri, and this is bang in the path of cyclones emanating from the Bay of Bengal. Come October every year in October, you have cyclone season in the south, on the east coast of India, from October to December, sometimes till January. So the east coast areas are very fairly well prepared for because there are cyclone shelters, etc. It's not as tsunami genic as, say, Andaman Nicobar Islands, but then yeah, disaster shelters have been built on the east coast of India. So that's also part of reconstruction. Or you could, if it might not, if it's damaged, then it has to be reconstructed. But if it is not damaged, then you need to build it for the next round of calamities, or yeah, disasters, natural calamities. So that is also to be calibrated in the cost of construction. And then, if that is apart from that, you have to have, like I said, earthquake safe housing or architecture, which is extremely expensive, but you can make it very sustainable by using bamboo, which is the new steel. So reconstruction in bamboo structures or mud housing can be a rammed earth construction. These can be very cost effective. Uh, so that's, and then you should, when you're mapping, you should also, what about scientific installations? You need to install a lot of scientific installations for like Doppler radar for flood forecasting, or you need to map the areas which are prone to flash floods, and so on. So scientific installations are very, 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 very expensive, and only governments can afford that. There can't be anything like corporate social responsibility for funding construction or installation of scientific installations. So that's very expensive. It perhaps calls for World Bank funding or that kind of international funding itself. And then apart from scientific installations and disaster shelters, yes, the cost of rescue and recovery can be prohibitive. Uh, the For us, the greatest lesson learned was in the aftermath of the tsunami. The cost of rescue and recovery can also include mental health, because it is debilitating. even for the forces who are the rescue and relief agencies who go there to rescue, the search and rescue teams are also, they're also made of human beings. So they have, it is very devastating to them. Apart from that, the gear, the logistics, and the equipment that you need for rescue and recovery, they are all worth investment, worthy investments for the future. Uh, it, India, for that matter, India, Thailand, all of them have state of the art technology, state of the art logistics. Uh, but then when you have ecosystem, rather environmental factors like El Nino, which is actually a metric atmospheric or a yeah, it's a meteorological phenomenon, and it's a cyclical geological phenomenon. It keeps recurring once in a few years. It's also triggered by volcanoes in the South Pacific. So that's when there are environmental disasters. It can lead to chronic drought in India. How do you reckon with the cost of drought in India? Um, it can be, in fact, the lessons learned are very well documented. Between 1983 and 87, India suffered a great amount of a very, very powerful drought. It lasted 4 years around the Indian Ocean rim. Even in Kenya and Ethiopia, it was very grim. So that at that time, India was considered as one of those countries which had to be emulated because there was transparent governance, there was democracy, a functional democracy, and dispersal of aid and relief were carried on very well. So there were a lot of best practices that have evolved. For after that, for example, every time India temperatures in India reach more than 38 degrees centigrade, uh, drought is declared in a particular district. So you see, those kind of things have been evolved now. So I think I need some water. Then the rescue cost of rescue and recovery. I mean, you can imagine in India, 12,000 people died in the Asian tsunami within 15 minutes. Nagapattinam district in Tamil Nadu suffered 6,025 mortalities over a period of 15 minutes. I need to drink some water. I have developed a toothache today, of all things. So, the recovering 6,025 or 6,065, I think, um, mortalities in one district was very challenging. And in fact, I remember the then DC, Deputy Commissioner of Nagapattinam district, who's today, I think, the Health Secretary of Tamil Nadu. He said since this emergency was declared in the after the Asian tsunami, excuse me, all administrators were called to come to the headquarters, and they in fact, I think he was at that time, he was the commissioner in the neighboring district of Tanjavur or so. Then he was asked to come to Nagapattinam. So, and something like 300 buses were immediately placed at the disposal of the government of Tamil Nadu to help survivors of the Asian tsunami, to migrate them, to shift them to safer locations. Those days there was no such thing as early warning or evacuation strategy, and there was no early warning when a tsunami happened. 12,000 people died. I think 6,000 of them in Nagapattinam within 15 minutes, and the rest in other places, Andaman Nicobar Islands, and so on. So these kind of costs for rescue, search and rescue and recovery. Recovery is over after a period of 3 to 5 days or so. They need a lot of equipment, then infrastructure to help rescue people and so on. Then there is also treatment of the injured to be given. These things cost a lot. Then you have to, the treatment. In India, for some reason, the compensation to an injured survivor is lesser when compared to the compensation given to a mortality. Well, that is because the logic is, because if the person is dead, there is no means of income for through him or her, so there has to be a greater compensation. But in the truth of the matter is, those who have survived a calamity have to face treatment, and that takes a certain amount of there is a cost to it, so there that has to be revisited. There is a need for recalibrating the cost of treatment of the injured. That is there, and these are all the costs that need to be inculcated. Cost of rehabilitation. Yeah, cost of rehabilitation is about what is the cost of the treatment for the injured. In fact, disaster activists, disaster mitigation activists, and they say, don't say rehabilitation, say habilitation. Especially if it is, in the realm of giving fresh training for uh, people, different categories of people. If there are children, firm and frail and infirm people, or indigenous people, people living with mental health issues, so they need to be trained for disaster preparedness. There is a cost to that. Apart from that, there is also the physical cost of recovery, reconstruction. Okay, in mainland India is not so earthquake prone. I mean, there are zones, yes. But I mean, let's take, there are different zones which are very prone to earthquakes. Northeast India is very prone to earthquake. The entire coastline of India is tsunami-genic, and many parts of North and Northwest India are also prone to earthquakes. But there are also large pockets of India which are not prone to seismic activity. So here in these areas, like say Madhya Pradesh, Karnataka, I mean, very few places you can say which are not going to have an earthquake at all. Those places do not have to invest very heavily in the immediate aftermath for earthquake safe housing. Maybe only in those areas which have to be prioritized as seismically active. There it is necessary to have earthquake safe construction and earthquake safe architecture. These things cost a lot, by the way, unless you're going to do it with bamboo, like I said. In Japan, for example, the cost of reconstruction is pretty, shall we say, cheap or inexpensive, because they do it with sustainable ecological solutions like rammed earth, bamboo, etc., and tiles, so on and so forth. So it is relatively inexpensive. Then, then what else do you have? What other costs are there in rehabilitation? Treatment of the injured. And then not just treatment of the injured, you have to make them worthy of economic engagement, of sustainable livelihoods for those people who have survived these kind of calamities. You have to provide them jobs. So it's a considerable amount of investment is there. We also need to have a framework which can, how shall I say it, which can create jobs for differently able people, people living with mental health issues, or people living with the frail and infirm, and so on. So for them, we have to evolve means of, livelihood security. Cost of sustainable rehabilitation, like I was saying, you need to create a sustainable income and a livelihood security option for the frail and infirm, the vulnerable communities, people living with mental health issues, people who are physically challenged, the frail, infirm, indigenous people. Uh, Now, take for example, indigenous people, tribals. They were the least affected in the Asian tsunami in Andaman Nicobar Islands itself, except the Nicobaris, they did suffer, but they are an integrated tribe. All the same, I mean, you don't have primitive tribal groups like, say, the Jaravas, the Great Andamanese, the Onges, etc. They did not suffer as much. One, because the Asian tsunami did not hit the coast of Andaman so much as it did the Nicobar. But nevertheless, just to take an example, if you want to prepare indigenous people for future calamities, you need to have a kind of a, shall we say, awareness program or early warning system that's inbuilt into their psyche, or a social psyche, or whatever, to the inbuilt into their social fabric. How do you can train children, you can make children very disaster savvy and so on. Similarly, you have to make the adults and the frail and infirm and different categories of people also disaster ready. So that's you can't call it sustainable rehabilitation, but sustainable preparedness, I could say. What are the sustainable solutions in disaster relief? Well, ecological solutions like earthquake safe architecture, it is a must, but it has to be ecological. That is when it is sustainable. Then you need to have disaster shelters, you need to have proportionate food security in terms of, and human development index. And then you should the development that is undertaken has to trickle down for everybody's benefit. The trickle down effect has to be visible. uh, so that's sustainable. And as far as disaster relief is concerned, well, if you're going to now, for example, the guy in Tamil Nadu, uh, there has been a particular tribe called the Irula tribes have been given livelihood training in fishing and crab trapping, aquaculture, and so on, whereas they were earlier hunter gatherers. So they have been integrated into the mainstream today with legal regime protecting them. They are now citizens of India. They were not earlier. They were not enfranchised to the government of India. So after the tsunami, in a great intervention. The MSSRF, the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation, got them integrated into the mainstream Indian shall we say, legal framework. They became citizens, they availed of all benefits and so on. So and now they are availing of formal education for the younger generation. They have livelihood security in terms of fishing, they have craft and gear, they have training and so on. That is as far as the adult fisher folk are concerned. For the children, the children have a separate school. Fishers children have a separate school, and they are also very well integrated, where the gender quotient and gender issues have all been mainstreamed, and the Irula tribals are getting mainstream education. Yes, there is a trade-off. They may lose their culture, but it is better than losing their lives to a natural calamity. So these kind of solutions have come up a lot. Then there is, there is a lot of sustainable solutions happening across the country in terms of environmental activism. Uh, so that's happening too. These are some of the sustainable solutions. Like, for example, the depleting groundwater table in India, or lack of water conservation. There are so many issues that need sustainable um solutions. So yeah, and not just not just in terms of disaster relief, but that if you integrate them, if there are human development quotient solutions, or if the human development touches every human being or every citizen, that itself is a big disaster relief. So that is how you incorporate that is how you incorporate human development into disaster mitigation. So these and yeah, you need to get them to undertake, shall we say, economic activity, any kind of economic activity for their own livelihood security. That's all there is to it. That is put very simply, but with diverse, shall we say, manifestations and interventions and so on. Any other questions? In Sri Lanka, for example, um, in Sri Lanka, the tsunami relief or the package included a lot of fiberglass boats and craft and gear, etc. And I think in some parts of Tamil Nadu as well, it became so much of investment, so much of relief, especially in Sri Lanka. They got so many. Every family almost got two fiber reinforced plastic boards, which is not ideally an ecological solution because it's very detrimental to the ocean. So every family has two FRP boards and access to microfinance, access to a lot of other things that came as a tsunami relief, but there aren't enough fish to justify that much of cost. So it became unsustainable fisheries. Once. I will tell you, the fishing grounds in Sri Lanka, the richest fishing grounds are in this part, in the Pok Straits, between Jaffna and the Rameswaram Peninsula. I think my cat knocked on the door. That's interesting. Is this Tamil or it is Sinhala? Tamil. Tamil. So the richest fishing grounds are here in this Nepok Straits above the Rameswaram Peninsula. And if you don't give them fishers the security, livelihood security, and this portion is, or this place, this area is also very geopolitically very sensitive. Tamil Nadu fishers routinely get caught by Sri Lankan Navy and vice versa. So there is a lot of, conflict. There is potential conflict over there. Uh, so that is one thing, one area which has not been adequately addressed, or there is no seems to be no political solution to this conflict. So those things have to be addressed. Huh. Is there any other question? Is the cost of reconstruction and rehabilitation smaller in developed countries? Huh, that's very interesting. Well, how can you say? No, I guess not. I have not done much of study in this area. If you take for instance Japan, uh, they are very frequently subjected to seismic activity, volcanic activity, but they have their disaster shelters in place. There are mock drills. Mock drills is an area where South Asia is very weakened. But let's come to that again. There is these people in Japan, they are very well trained. There is a lot of discipline and a national character, etc. So if disaster strikes and they observe discipline and they do what they're told, they do exactly what they're expected to do. Go to a disaster shelter and they do social service. They do not act small in terms of pecuniary benefit, etc. But that apart, that's human nature. You can't blame them. Then they have well, mock drills take care of everything. They're very well trained. But reconstruction also, there again, Japan has an advantage because they take a lot of ecological measures the, to make it very sustainable. And they have permanent edifices in terms of reconstruction, etc., disaster shelters, etc. Their reconstruction efforts are all ecologically feasible, and they don't suffer from, shall we say, food insecurity and things like that. In fact, Japan, being on the Pacific Rim, is very seismically volatile. Apart from being seismically and volatile and volcanologically active, they have a number of active volcanoes in Japan. Let me show you Japan, where it is. This is Japan, and it's very, very seismically volatile. It's not just seismically, also they have a number of active volcanoes. I think Japanese territory comes till here to here, and they have a number of yeah, not just seismic events and volcanological events. They also have they face a lot of storms from the Pacific, etc. But they are prepared, and it's very common for them. So there are, mock drills and announcements which go on the public address system or the mass media, and everybody follows suit. Everybody does what is expected of them. That is the kind of, shall we say, mock drills and awareness that you need in India. In India, or for that matter, everywhere, anywhere else. That a level of awareness and preparedness is necessary to mitigate the cost of reconstruction. What was the question? The cost of reconstruction. So they don't have to rebuild constantly. They have built in their their infrastructure in such a way. Talking of infrastructure, if you build these fantastic bridges and highways across the seas, etc., or if you have foolhardy interventions like having a railway on the sea or undersea, these are recipes for disaster. Of course, you have precedents like the London tube railway, tunnel railway between England and France. There are these things, but that was such a huge cost. Do you think India can afford it, or anywhere in South Asia? And you don't have to have these kind of over ambitious infrastructure. Oh, sorry, Bidamma. Oh, that's my cat. She has. ಅಮ್ಮ ನಾನು ಲೈವ್ ಇದೀನಮ್ಮ. It was about the cat. Okay, cost of scientific installation. Uh, are you asking about what is the cost of scientific installation? She wants to go through it. My cat makes such a noise. Um, they take liberty with me. The cost of scientific installation, that's a very, very interesting question. India has developed, for example, India has developed uh, what's called geological GIS, Geographical Information Systems, I think it's called. That has helped map the tsunami-genic areas of, for example, Tamil Nadu. They are able to forecast the exact path of a tsunami in Tamil Nadu. Then there are times we have the Indian National Center for Ocean Information Services in Hyderabad, which does tsunami forecasting for large parts of the Indian Ocean region. They have expertise and the core competence to place ocean algorithms and forecast the path of the tsunami and the impact, shall we say, the 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 magnitude of the tsunami. That's possible. Then you have Doppler radar systems. We need much more, but Doppler radar systems help forecast the path of cyclones and the intensity of the cyclone too. So those kind of installations are in place. A lot more needs to be done. Uh, but there's also something called traditional wisdom. The If you go by the lunar almanac, or just the lunar cycle, you're able to forecast precisely the date of earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. The empirical knowledge. Then there's also this. There are different schools of thought in when it comes to earthquake forecasting. They can do earthquake forecasting in the short and medium term today. Long term is not possible, but it's possible nevertheless. We are coming there. And what other kinds of scientific installation do we need? You need a lot of scientific installations, and like to calculate or calibrate the ocean algorithms to quantify the tsunami's path. Or, for example, now the Tonga volcano eruption in the South Pacific has created some kind of a change in the barometric pressure across the world. This is being monitored by weather stations around the world. And then you need scientific installations to forecast and expect the El Nino events, El Nino currents, and how will it affect uh, different geographical areas with unseasonal weather. How do you predict unseasonal weather and its manifestations in a particular latitude and longitude, or in a particular geographical area? So these are things that are still found wanting, at least in South Asia. El Nino is a very, very tricky process. And then how do you measure? Well, you have how do you measure the heat generated by submarine volcanoes, or how can you forecast or even measure seamount activity? Seamount meaning submarine volcanoes. So these are the kind of scientific installations that are still needed in India. All right, in India, South Asia. Then these are as far as natural calamities and seismic occurrences are concerned. But then what about supply chains? And that's a different thing, I guess. It's not scientific installation. You need supply chains for, in the pandemic, we've felt the need for supply chain and logistics, etc. So those kind of and scientific installations, well, you need what do you say, genome mapping institutes across India in the pandemic. That's one thing we have learned. We need it. Um, it's not just ocean algorithms or part of tsunami. Tsunami was a rare event, but you need agrometeorologically, we need a lot of installations to forecast either drought or flood, to map flood prone areas and so on. You need a lot of these kind of GIS systems and installations like that. Uh, as for the cost of scientific installation, it could be anything between it goes can go up to infinity, I guess. There is a need. That's why UNESCO came up with funding for installation of tsunami forecasting establishments in India and Indonesia, which was very surprising given that Indonesia is so prone to tsunami-genic events like either volcanoes or earthquakes. The fact that there was such a big tsunami-genic or a tsunami triggering earthquake s- had there was no scientific installation uh, to uh, to forecast a tsunami after such a huge earthquake. This was missing, and there was the whole administrative procedure or the standard operating procedure was missing in entire Indian Ocean rim countries. None of the countries had a system in place. In fact, the Pacific Tsunami Warning System, the scientists working there, they tried very hard to contact their brethren in Indian Ocean rim countries because they knew a tsunami would be triggered, but they didn't know whom to contact because there was no system in place. So there was no way they could. And somebody tried calling. I think one of the scientists in Pacific Tsunami Warning System wanted to call the government, the president of India. But what would the president of India have done? There was no system in place for either evacuation or early warning of a tsunami that would have been definitely triggered after an M9 earthquake. That was, and in fact, in India, the it was a Sunday when the Asian tsunami happened, and when the tsunami started hitting the coast of Andaman Nicobar Islands, there's many curious officers found out why it's happening, and they said, "Well, no, nothing can be done. The epicenter of the earthquake was in Indonesia, so we can't do anything." That was the attitude uh, of the government servants in Nicobar. He said, we can't do anything about it. Yeah, you can't do anything about triggering a tsunami being inevitable, but at least if they had made an effort to announce on the public address system to go to higher ground, many more lives would have been saved. That was missing. So it's not just I mean the rare event of tsunami, but you have a lot of other things in the event of in the day and age of climate change. Sea level rise has to be monitored very accurately. And there are a lot of climate scientists, so called one climate scientist told me without batting an eyelid that over the past 100 years, the Arabian Sea has risen by 100 meters, did he say? Or 400 meters, I don't know. He said, uh, how do you measure it? And what is the documentation? That over the past 100 years, it has gone up by 400 meters or even 100 meters. I think it go every 100 years the sea level rises by 40 centimeters. That is now scientific knowledge. Uh, but how can you make blatant allegations that, or conjecture to say that the Arabian Sea has risen by 400 meters? And that too without giving documentary proof. A scientist in Bangalore told me that. Earthquake forecasting in India, or for that matter, anywhere in the world, earthquake forecasting is still in the realm of infancy. Hmm. You can go that there are certain dates on which earthquakes are likely to happen. It could be on the 4th or the 11th or the 18th or the 26th of a particular month. This is because you can calibrate it against the lunar cycle. Uh, okay, that's about as what it is at present. There are others like the late Dr. Arunachalam Kumar who used to say that so many whales or cetaceans or marine mammals have been stranded in this part of the world, and that is because they are aware of the changes in the electromagnetic frequencies of the ocean floor, which is a prelude to seismic events, I suppose. So based on that, he would make accurate forecasts. He on the 29th of November 2004, he made a forecast that within the next 3 weeks he was expecting a massive earthquake somewhere between New Zealand and Indonesia. Mm. He said, I think, yeah, somewhere between Indonesia and New Zealand, he was expecting a massive earthquake and a volcanological explosion. And bingo, it happened on the 26th of December. Another very interesting thing is, um, this is again, I don't know whether it's called traditional wisdom or lunar almanac. One survivor of the tsunami in Bangalore, she had been foretold by an astrologer that she will drown within the next 3 weeks or 3 months. She would drown, and there were chances of her dying. She had been told. So, as coming back to earthquake forecasting, uh, scientific community does not accept that it can be forecast. They say it can happen anytime, anywhere. But there are ways to do earthquake forecasting by the scientific establishment. All they need to do is measure the seismic pressure being built up somewhere and document it in public domain. Then everybody can see it. Then you can, if you're a aware population, you should know that, and there are certain points where the earthquakes happen, the ruptures will happen, or there are certain areas in the world where earthquake activity is known, seismic activity. It could be on fault lines, or it could be at the edges of tectonic plates. That's where it is likely to happen. One second. Uh, so that is where you can expect the earthquake. If the seismic pressure is built up, say in so many units, much more than in place A than in place B, you can expect the earthquake to happen more likely to happen in place A than in place B. So that is how you have to evolve, or you have to interpret this data. That's one way of looking at it. Other ways, yeah, like I said, my personally I go by the lunar almanac. In fact, on 3 or 4 occasions, I've been very precise. On 11th of November 2016, I think, it was 11th of November was the new moon day. So and it has something to do with the lunar cycle and traction. On the 11th of November 2016, I was expecting an earthquake somewhere in the south of Japan. Then let me show you this place. There is a particular earthquake, volcano somewhere here. I think it's called this Okinawa. It starts with S. The name of the volcano starts with S. Uh, Shakuriyama or something like that it goes. And that day, because of this volcanic eruption on the 11th of November, no, on the 11th of November 2016, there was an earthquake in Shakuriyama or Shikuriyama, something like that. There is an earthquake. It's a very powerful earthquake. I mean, volcano, sorry. Somewhere near it happened, and it happened because of the volcano. The volcano, it was an early warning for the volcanic eruption, but still it had to do with the lunar cycle. The eruption happened to be about the in time in sync with the lunar cycle. So there is something to do there. We need to research it more. So those things happen. That is as far as earthquake. Where was I? Where is the question? That is as far as earthquake forecasting is concerned. Is that a satisfactory answer for you? How do disasters impact developing countries differently from developed countries? See, developing countries are more vulnerable to the impact of disaster, because they do not have the infrastructure or the resilience. There is no lacking in, there is a they generally lack in awareness. There is no such thing as mock drills. Then preparedness infrastructure, then evacuation strategy and infrastructure. Or if you have, like for example, now with the pandemic, the more vaccinations there are, the more resilient you are to the virus. But yeah, so that kind of preparedness has to be there, whether it is a seismic activity or pandemic preparedness. There has to be some kind of resilience, and that is missing in developing countries. because of the cost usually, and the cost of infrastructure and so on. Whereas in developed countries, as far I remember, the then oceanographer, the chief oceanographer of INCOIS had told me, tsunamis are very common in the Pacific Rim, madam, he had said. But they are able to withstand it because they have disaster shelters, evacuation strategies, mock drills, and evacuation infrastructure. So the moment they have a magnet M6 or above earthquake, then there is an announcement in the mass media as well as in public address system. The bulletins go out. People are subscribing to their SMS alerts and so on. So people know that there is a massive earthquake that is likely to trigger a tsunami, and they go to higher ground or to disaster shelters or whatever. So that is as far as seismic activities are concerned. Now, for example, in Tonga recently, which is not such a developed country, when there was an volcanic activity for the past 1 month. It was being observed, but suddenly, and in fact, on the 15th, 14th of January, they said, I think the Geological Survey of Tonga had declared the volcano as dormant. But on 15th, it erupted in so violently. It was not so much of lava that came out of it, but it was more of water from the sea that blew off. When the lid blew up, it is supposed to have ejected up to the, what is it called, the ejectile, is supposed to have reached 98,000. It has breached the stratosphere, and it has reached some 39 kilometers according to various reports. So that is now, and it triggered a commensurate tsunami. And I think from the Nuku'alofa, the capital of Tonga, to the volcanic island was barely some 65 kilometers or so. The tsunami hit hard, and though the volcanic island itself was not populated, the nearest coast was Nuku'alofa, which is the capital of Tonga, and it hit so hard. But then, yeah, there is a resident population, but they all went to higher ground, and thanks to some amount of awareness after the Japanese tsunami and the Asian tsunami, etc. But there have not been such a big death toll, at least not so far that we know of. Um, so yeah, so if there is, it is inversely proportional. The calamity and the impact of the calamity is inversely proportional to the amount of infrastructure and economic development there is. How do countries recover from natural disasters? Yeah, there is a process. There is first search and rescue, then there is recovery, and then there is near-term rehabilitation, and then there is long-term rehabilitation. Somewhere in between comes interagency coordination. That's a whole chapter in itself. Interagency coordination, and then you have long-term reconstruction, rehabilitation, etc. So there are some stages in disaster mitigation parlance, so stage wise, that's how it happens. And you can't say now, for example, in the pandemic, uh, the cost of reconstruction or recovery is going to be very high because it was debilitating on lives and livelihoods. When the pandemic broke out, there was this very severe lockdown. Overnight, not even overnight, within 5 hours, the entire country shut down in India. So we know what happened to millions and millions of migrant laborers. They lost their livelihood overnight. There were people who started walking back to their hinterland homes, and they walked for thousands of kilometers. A pregnant woman was mowed down in Maharashtra via train because she was so exhausted. She slept on the railway track. That's unimaginable cruelty. Can you imagine? It is so sad that such a thing came to such a pass. There was no idea of how to be prepared for a lockdown that hit us so hard. Hindsight is 2020, but when we had something called Janata curfew 2 days before the lockdown, when Indian Prime Minister had called for a voluntary curfew 2 days before the lockdown was announced, there was scope for some kind of administrative experience or experiment, shall we say. There was definitely scope for an administrative experiment to prevent, and if things had happened more transparently, then we would not have had to go into lockdown with at 4 hours notice. So that was a lesson learned again in hindsight. That was the one very, it became very touchy, and the government of India was criticized ruthlessly and very widely. Uh, so that was a very tragic episode and a very tragic manifestation of lack of preparedness. But again, the next calamity or the next disaster, we are never fully prepared for the next disaster. We don't know how it's going to hit us, whether it's going to be a geological calamity, whether it will be a economic calamity, whether it will be a man-made calamity. What do we know? No matter which calamity it is, the man-made, it is, the calamity has its impact on the human landscape, so it becomes a disaster at that stage. And when there is human mismanagement, the scale of the disaster increases manifold. We've been online for 1 hour. Any more questions? How do countries recover from natural disasters? I think I covered that. I'm not sure. Which country is most prepared for an earthquake? Which country is most prepared for an earthquake? Most definitely Japan. Not even New Zealand, not even then to some extent, to a large extent, the USA also, because they have FEMA, the Federal Earth Emergencies Management Agency. They have their standard operating procedures very well documented, and they have standard protocols and yeah, procedures, etc. They also have installations, they have the infrastructure to cope with, but they're not prepared on the east coast of America. They're not prepared for what is expected to be a very massive tsunami that will occur eventually at some point in across the Atlantic, the east coast of the United States, which is much more economically developed. Uh, but they will not be, they're not prepared for disaster because it's not disaster resilient architecture or disaster resilient economic development in the east coast of the USA for that matter. Um, but Japan is by and large the most prepared because they have mock drills. Mock drills is one thing that we haven't in India. We are very poor in, for that matter, South Asia, anywhere across South Asia, from starting from Pakistan, India, Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Maldives, Myanmar. These are countries which are not economically very resilient. India might be much more resilient economically than the other countries, but then if you have the fiscal resilience, then you will have that much more preparedness. It's very simple. Does development affect earthquake? Yes. Now I was just saying the east coast of the United States of America is so economically powerful, but none of it is earthquake safe or tsunami safe. They have New York, for example, is very congested. The buildings, especially in Manhattan and East Village, Bronx, etc., you have it chock a block. That is when you will see if they are in violation of ecological solutions or ecological best practices. Excuse me. If they are, then reconstruction becomes very impediment. Uh, it's very expensive because that is why human development index and the laws have to be respected. For example, construction of bylaws. If they do not, in any city for that matter, if you do not respect bylaws or yeah, construction bylaws or building code, then you're violating it. And next time when then there's an earthquake that happens and there's going to be a huge human toll, reconstruction is all the more expensive, and the human toll is very devastating. So development at the cost of environment is very expensive, simply put. uh, yeah, if you have a sustainable economy like for example in Japan, uh, you can reconstruction is less expensive, reconstruction is more feasible fiscally, so naturally it will be it will any natural calamity will have less of an impact. Similarly, and this holds across the board for all disasters, if there are alternate livelihood options for people across the human society or the human landscape, then there is resilience built into the social fabric, so to say. Then obviously the impact of the disaster will be lesser. Take for example the current pandemic. Migrant laborers were the ones who were most affected because of livelihood insecurity when the lockdown started. But those who had economic resilience, those who had alternate livelihood options or the infrastructure, be it telecom or otherwise, to have their own means of access to food security, um, health security, livelihood security, etc., they were not so affected as the migrant laborers were. So that's how it's always inversely proportional. To make it seamless, you need to have sustainable solutions. If it has to be on par, if development has to be on par with with disaster preparedness, then it has to be sustainable solutions. I hope that was clear. There was a lot of theory to it. I've been online for 1 full hour. Is that enough of an interaction for this week? I think so. Oh, it's been 8:45. And thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. It's been a great learning experience as usual. Uh, these are all being documented and it will be sent eventually to the, the relevant agencies. Thank you so much for tuning in and take care. Thank you and keep coming back to us with more questions. Let's do our best to, shall we say, grow together. Okay.